Hello YouTube, this is Morgan Airspeed Prime here with my next Avatar video, and today I just want to take a look back at the Kyoshi novels. And the reason I want to do that today specifically is because today is basically it's the 1 year anniversary of the Kyoshi duology coming to an end. The Shadow of Kyoshi was released July 21st, 2020, so exactly 1 year to the day. The two novels that they announced, the story that we were told we were going to get came to an end. And the reason I specifically want to do a book, to celebrate the anniversary of this is because I think these two novels together are the most important pieces of Avatar content that we've got since Korra came to an end. I've said this I think a few times when I've talked about the Kyoshi books, but that this is your third pillar of Avatar. There's Avatar, there's Korra, there's Kyoshi now. These are the books that took Kyoshi from being a character who was well liked and appreciated, but a lot of it was more of the sort of like haha funny meme characterization of Kyoshi as just the Avatar who wants to kill people and just making fun jokes about her always like accelerating the situation to violence and stuff like that. Here we got the more nuanced take on the character to the point where she truly is one of the most interesting characters in the entire franchise, and not just because she's sort of cool and powerful, but we get to see the struggles for her unique journey as the Avatar, and a whole different era within the Avatar world. And it's so interesting given that right now, when we're recording this, of course, we're sort of right in the middle of the hype as we build up to the Kickstarter for the Avatar role-playing game, Avatar Legends, coming out. And one of the eras in the game is Kyoshi's era. And without these two books, we quite simply, I don't think, would be able to do that era. Or if they attempted to do it, it would be very much based off a few small moments and there'd be no real depth or nuance to it. So these books have led to, like I said, a real creation of an entire era that we really want to go back to. Because one of the probably legacies of these books is just that especially that I've seen as being, an Avatar content creator who is, I suppose, known for basically covering everything and as in-depth as I possibly can. I'm often asked, do you think there'll be a follow-up to these two Kyoshi books? And I always have to say that, my opinion is that we will get more Kyoshi content, but I'm not sure if the next novel necessarily will be a Kyoshi novel. To me, I almost view it as these books have elevated Kyoshi's story to a level where I would not be at all surprised if an Avatar Studios series is Kyoshi related in some way, and that they use the novels as a way to sort of bring other characters to the spotlight, like they did with Kyoshi here, the Shadow of Kyoshi more specifically did with Karuk as well, really developing him and changing the entire fandom perspective on that character, to the point where I'm like, I wouldn't mind if the next book was a Karuk book, finishing the final part of his story. Now, the thing with Kyoshi, of course, is that even if you read these two books, there's still so much more of her story to come. We end with her not being particularly old at all. We've just had the very start of her journey. That's effectively what these two books are. We know this is a character who goes on to accomplish this, and this in her life, and it's a very long life. She lives to be 230 years old. There's so much room to play with. So absolutely, they could come back and do novels, maybe set in a different era of her life if you wanted to. But I'd also just be cautious about having the novel format for Avatar just be the Kyoshi format, which is why I'd be more advocating for we're likely going to get more novels. We've had the rumor from the German publisher of the Avatar books that from their information, they seem to have information that suggests there'll be a new novel next year, 2022. So we don't know yet how truthful that is. We'll see as the months pass and we get closer to, I suppose, them announcing this book ahead of time. Realistically, I suppose the expectation would be that, like, probably before the end of the year, we'd maybe have some sort of an announcement about the next novel. And the main thing I'd say on that is just that, like, sure, there'll be an expectation for it to be more Kyoshi, but I think the exploration of this format is probably the thing that is also just as interesting as the specific Kyoshi story, because these novels, you know, like I said, they're the most important content that we've got in the sort of off period for Avatar post Korra, and they really highlighted that the comics, when they want to, can do very important stories, but by the time the novels had come out, it felt like they'd already told most of the very important stories in the comics that they were willing to tell, like the promise to search the rift. And then the comics that have come after that have mainly been sort of more set up for the futures, but these, you know, follow-ups haven't happened yet and don't look like they're going to happen with regards to like Azula's story, continuing post-imbalance. They've specifically decided to not do that. So Avatar comics look like, okay, the best we can hope for is a really, really strong one-shot character piece. Korra comics are still, you know, they're still trying to organize it so that they're a more consistent thing. And again, there's rumors that we're getting the third Korra comic next year, again, also from the German comic publisher. But we've been heard rumors about this third Korra comic series for ages. And, you know, if it delivers, fantastic. But, you know, there's, you know, in my mind, they've been sort of hit and miss. They, to me, missed with the first Korra comic series, hit with the second one. So they're kind of 50-50 at this point with regards to, you know, how good they are. The novels so far have been, you know, 100%. They've both hit. And, you know, I have so much content up on my channel reviewing these books in terms of non-spoiler review for both of them, spoiler review for both of them, and, you know, a video discussing each chapter of both of these books. So over the course of my channel, I've done, just in terms of like review discussion content, like what, 50 plus videos on these books, plus some other videos that have sort of very heavily utilized the information we got from these books. And that is something I can't say about much else of the content that we get. In that, like, Katara and the Pirate Silver was like, I reviewed it, and that was really it, because I don't even think I mentioned a moment from that as being one of the best moments of the year, the year that book came out. And it's just like, okay, you know, that's kind of where we're at. You know, the depth that you can get in a novel just opened our eyes to, yeah, like they can tell full-on Avatar stories in other mediums. That the comics are always going to be, you know, a little hit and miss, depending on what writer you have and what story you try to tell. But because of what you can do in novels, like, it opens the door to tell a story more similar to the big journeys of Avatar and Korra. And they did that here. And it's so interesting the way the fandom has sort of evolved, I suppose, with the Kyoshi novels, and that, like, you know, Avatar Kyoshi, it's its own subreddit that is kind of its own, almost like slightly separate section of the fandom, where like a lot of the really hardcore people that are into the books, like this has kind of become probably like their favorite era, that their favorite characters theoretically are Kyoshi, and even Rangi has, like, you know, jumped into the spotlight as being a huge fan favorite character. And that's fascinating, given that she's a character who, like, visually only appears effectively in like fan art and then like one or two official pieces of art, which again is very telling of, like, they got it right here. And while I suppose we'll primarily think of the success with Avatar and Korra returning to Netflix as being the reason we got Avatar Studios, but I think you have to sort of consider, you know, Mike heavily assisting on these books, sort of, you know, to a degree being like a co-writer, you know, with Michael Dante DiMartino. His involvement in these, I suppose you could say, more heavily than I think the Korra comics, you know, got him back into sort of thinking about Avatar again, because, you know, having to think much more heavily about the past and Kyoshi's backstory, her story, working with a writer like FCE, who's really strong and, like, in terms of like continuity and stuff like that, really knows his Avatar. I get the sense like this got Mike's sort of writing kind of juices flowing in a way, and so I think inadvertently, like, we may not consider it, but these two books and Mike's work on these probably has opened a few doors with regards to the type of things they now see that they can do. They now see that the fandom like with regards to the content that they're going to be doing going forward with Avatar Studios. Like I said, a Kyoshi follow up, I think they almost like have to do it, even if it is maybe just a few shorts. Who wouldn't love to see just a little animation that features Kyoshi, that features Rangi, features like Wong, Kirima, and stuff like that? That would be, really, really fantastic to see. Lao Ge and all that sort of stuff. And I suppose that brings me into like the next point about these books that makes them so strong. Is just that from a world building point of view, what I'd consider my strength as an Avatar fan to be, and that being kind of knowledge of the world, connecting the dots and stuff like that. This gave us so much to work with. And the point I always bring up is like, look at the opening pages of this book and what it does. It immediately tells you, yeah, you haven't had this in a while, but here is some world building. Like, look, like first two words in the book, Yokoya Port was a town easy to overlook. And then they go on to basically explain to you the positioning of Yokoya Port in the world and why it's actually technically in a nice position, but other factors like the strong current around that area of the world mean, even though it's this amazing port town, it gets overlooked because no one sort of needs to land there. And so the major thing that brings this place into focus is that we happen to have, the Avatar mansion here, and then we happen to discover the actual Avatar here. And this is why this Kyoshi Island place that we see in Avatar, previously, was Yokoya Port. And that's just really, really cool, just the world building about Yokoya. We know roughly about the history of it transferring into, Kyoshi Island, and just finding out all this stuff about it, about how Jeonju, having the Avatar Mansion here, really put the place on the map to a degree. That's wonderful. And then, again, within pages, they're talking about specifically the different nations' ways on how they go about locating the Avatar. This immediately brings you into the idea, this is not just going to be, like a lot of the other content sometimes can be, which is just the writers just writing around stuff that we already know. No, so much of this stuff is like new, it's clever, it works well within the world, it helps to explain other stuff that we already know. In that the Air Nomad relics for the Avatar, we already knew about them, but they'd never made it maybe inherently clear that that was a specific Air Nomad thing, that's their way of doing it. This book really introduces that idea more clearly, that no, those relics are the Air Nomad relics. That's how they do it. The Earth Kingdom has a different way. The Water Tribe has a different way. Fire Nation, different way. And so that's just really nice world building for the different nations and highlighting that the search for the Avatar is a thing that is an organized process. That we saw the White Lotus in Korra do it. We didn't, I suppose, really get to see the full process necessarily about it. In ATLA, beyond the monks just telling Aang this, but you could see the way that the high ups in the Air Nomads then sort of tried to manage Aang. Here's how they do it when they're still struggling to find the Avatar. That the Earth method isn't working. Let's switch over to using the Air method, even though we're not dealing with that specific Avatar. It's just clever use of a thing we saw in Avatar, but expanding it out so much. Which obviously brings us into, I suppose the main thing just in terms of setting the uniqueness of this era, Kyoshi's era within the Avatar world, is just it's like the era of Dao Fei, the era of bandits to a degree. that in terms of the Earth Kingdom, Kyoshi's nation, of course, this is going to be the main conflict that she has to deal with, is just that, the Earth King or Queen being on the throne is always this sort of consistent thing across the eras, but here specifically is a time period where these scattered groups across the Earth Kingdom are laying their claim to, power in their own section, and how that's causing trouble for the people who don't want to be involved with bandit groups. And we've seen, like, I suppose, allusions to this in some of the other material, in that, even in Korra's time, it looks like in the Earth Kingdom there are still bandit groups. We see, elements of this in Avatar as well. But here it is, like, laid out really fully. Here is where it was sort of, at its worst. And even when we catch up with Kyoshi here, they almost imply that, the really dark days of the Dao Fei are behind us because of what Jeonju and Karuk's companions did, which is another absolutely fantastic thing that they did in terms of just framing this story, which is that not just the idea of, like, Kyoshi as the Avatar, and what makes her interesting in terms of her discovery is that she was, overlooked in a way, and someone else was thought to be the Avatar. And then when she finally is found out as the Avatar, that changes everything. That switch from false Avatar to real Avatar is where the book truly, kicks into gear. Things change. And because you had a substantial amount of the book without that detail, so much changes. And that's that, the spirit chapter, one of the best chapters in the first book. It's why that is so impactful, because it's so dramatic, it's so intense, of Jeonju beginning to, doing something like, you can't forgive him for this. He just killed Kelsang. He abandoned Yoon. And in that one moment, you set up the entirety of Yoon's character arc for the second book. And Jeonju as a character, like, what a well-written villain, like, better than so much of what we've had before. So they got this right on just so many levels, especially with, like, Jeonju and his involvement with the Dao Fei, and he's like the sort of very much anti-Dao Fei guy, but then he is the villain because of what he does. But they also make you, a lot of the other characters are kind of like Lao Ge is like, I actually quite like this guy because he actually tries to sort of change things in the right way. And Kyoshi can acknowledge that to a certain point, but can never forgive him for the specific, evil acts that he's done. So it's that really unique dynamic where you see Jeonju has enemies of his own. And it's not a case of the enemy of my enemy is my friend, in that, like, Chamberlain Hui is not really an ally Kyoshi wants, even though he's against Jeonju. Jeonju is better as a political figure than Chamberlain Hui, because Hui and those other, politicians just want to keep things the same. They don't want to change things, whereas Jeonju did stop the Yellowneck uprising and is trying to make things better, but his importance within keeping the Earth Kingdom stable, you can see it's sort of gone to his head. He is someone very important in keeping the Earth Kingdom this way, but he's let it, play on him too much. And his arc through that first book of, being a little bit of the mastermind of the situation, but then the situation just getting so out of control that you see him being unable to hold it all together. He has to make more and more desperate moves, to the point when the final battle comes around, it's a, battered and scarred almost Jeonju who comes in. Like, he's had to poison himself and his friends, kill all these people around him, send shearshoes after people, kidnap people to force these situations to get what he wants. He was just so well done. And then all of those Kyoshi reveals that you had throughout the first book, surrounding, her parents, and the major reveal that her mother was an airbender, those are moments that, like, I remember reading that for the first time and just being like, whoa. And I can't really, in my head, remember too many moments, I think maybe like in Avatar in general, when I've had reactions like that. A lot of like Korra Book 1 with its mystery reveals. Yes, sure, like Tarlok's a bloodbender and so on. But there were so many of those moments. Like the spirit, what happened in that? Kelsang being killed, Yoon being sacrificed, the introduction of Father Glowworm. They were all big, big moments. And then the reveal about Jaisa and her story, just this idea that someone leaves the air nomads and becomes a bandit, becomes a Dao Fei leader, but here is a group that actually has more of a sense of honor to it, even though they're still criminals. The Flying Opera Company, and how, going in a way, you could tell that one of the core points that they wanted to accomplish in, especially the first book, was to explain all these symbols of Kyoshi. What do these things mean to her? Why does she have that headdress? Where does she get the outfit from, the armored outfit? What's with the makeup? What's with the fans? And they go along and explain it all. And some of it's rather simple, but it adds extra meaning to it. And so you look at Suki and the other Kyoshi warriors, and them wearing basically all these symbols of Kyoshi. And they talk about them, more generally in ATLA. Suki explains that like this represents this represents that, and then you find out that like, oh yeah, the makeup is the Flying Opera Company, and they talk about how like the white and the red, it's a big contrast, and it's like it's more of a Dao Fei thing, like as a criminal group, but the Kyoshi warriors are this group who you see as being warriors, like bastions of justice in a way, not Dao Fei like at all. But that Kyoshi pledges Dao Fei oaths to the Flying Opera Company. So, she is Dao Fei and sticks to it. And that helps to explain a lot of her actions in other situations of like, this is her issue with authority, is that because even though she doesn't like the violent Dao Fei, she also doesn't particularly like, leaders, especially Earth Kingdom style leaders who think they have it all going on basically, yet they have no sense for what the people are actually like dealing with. So, Escape from the Spirit World Kyoshi, the way she deals with the Earth King, you see why she does that. This helps to explain a lot of like why she doesn't take down Qin the Conqueror immediately. Is that because, if the people don't like the Earth King, who am I to sort of get in the way of that happening? And that's why I do want them to eventually tell a little bit of a story that like has Kyoshi interacting with Qin and cover the actual like canon interpretation of why she makes those decisions that she makes, because obviously she only goes to tackle him when he comes for Yokoya, and then she turns it into an island and makes it basically isolationist from the rest of the world. And the reason she does that is that so it's not considered a if anyone else wants to take over the whole Earth Kingdom, this place is separate. And just the intent behind that of like she is so not into politics that she just, I'm out, back away from everything. And I suppose it helps to explain a few things like that, like why Roku, for instance, sort of lives on an island to himself and almost has a group of people that are like his people, almost separate from the Fire Nation. That yes, the Avatar could be allied with a specific nation or so on, but I suppose typically it is better to be in sort of a kind of middle ground position like that. And I just think that's it. There's some very interesting things about how, even though these books don't go as far as to fully connect the dots with a lot of the other incidents in Kyoshi's life, they give you a sense for like, oh, here's why she's so interested in justice. Here's where her sense of like being willing to kill people who are a true threat to justice and the people around her. Here's where it comes from. Here's the person who thought her the sort of philosophy around, killing and so on. Here's the explanation behind why she does live to be 230 years old. And it all is fascinating and really, really interesting. Again, Lauga, I want to see more of a story about like where he goes, is like, because theoretically Lauga could still be alive, but you almost get the sense something happens between him and Lauga and Kyoshi as things go on. So, you want to get back to some of these situations to find out, like, oh yeah, that's kind of interesting. Even just stuff like Kyoshi's initial bending masters are like Dao Fei members and Rangi. It's just such an interesting journey that she goes on, that like Rangi supports Kyoshi enough that she basically becomes a Dao Fei herself. And just that journey of like fairly straight laced Rangi growing to sort of have a friendship and appreciation and a true understanding of like what it is to be part of the Flying Opera Company, and like being a Dao Fei in that sense is a nice journey for that character to go on, and you don't expect it to be that way, but she ends up having that actual respect for this thing she wanted no part of at the start, to the point where those moments where Rangi puts on the colors of the Flying Opera Company, it's a big moment. And I definitely like that. Like little dynamics like that of like Kirima and Rangi being at odds with each other, but then growing to actually realize they're the two tacticians of the team, and they do kind of get on quite well. You have the romance between Kyoshi and Rangi, which is another thing that, of course, made the book really stand out to a lot of people, and it's really well done as well, as like Korasami sort of like opened the door for a lot of this stuff, and then here is that done kind of, I suppose, more in the way maybe you wanted Korasami done, where they're much more open about it, and it's like, oh, imagine we got more of this in the comics going forward. Imagine they were able to do a little bit more in Korra. Here's an example of that all that stuff worked so well as we went on. And the first book ends with a really nice hook for the second book with Yoon is back, but there's something spiritual, dark, tainted about him, which brings us into Shadow of Kyoshi. And this book is interesting in the sense that if I was to compare the two, I'd say that I think overall I have a slight preference for the Rise of Kyoshi over the Shadow of Kyoshi, even though Shadow of Kyoshi arguably has sort of the bigger moments. The highs that this book hits are the highest in the entire series. It's not to say that this book doesn't have high highs. I already talked about like some of the big moments. Zhu Ping-an being revealed to be a lightning bender, a lot of the major reveals about Kyoshi's backstory, the spirit chapter, a lot of the iceberg. There's some really, really strong moments in this. You can't forget that. And I really like the Flying Opera Company just dynamic because it's more present in this book. Here, what you have instead is like, okay, Fire Nation in this era, really, really interesting. We always love to know more about the Fire Nation. Kyoshi more dealing with politics, and just her connection with Karuk. They're the true highlights. The issue to me with this book comes in is that it's a good deal shorter than the first book, and it doesn't necessarily feel like this was just a natural choice, that the story just happened to be shorter and there was no need for it to have all these other pages. There's moments in this book where it feels like you have skipped over content that you probably should include in the book. And it's, around this kind of like 3/4 way point through the book, I think is where the problems begin to come in. Where it's about 100 pages shorter than the first book. And I think you can feel the lack of those 100 pages, because there's a very specific point in the book where Kyoshi leaves to go, kidnap someone, and what she does is she basically, in a way, sort of upsets Rangi. She goes against Rangi in doing this. This action is going to be terrible politically if this kind of blows up in her face. And Rangi is very upset about this because a lot of stuff has happened. Rangi is put under a huge amount of sort of emotional pressure as the book goes on. And this is in a way like the last straw. She's had issues with her mother in this book, and now Kyoshi has done this kind of almost behind her back. And we just don't come back to Rangi. We don't come back to Heiran, who's been a kind of focus in this book as, a kind of like one of the older but main character Fire Nation people in the book. And then you have this whole section as like Kyoshi more deals with Zoryu and so on in the book, where they're not around. And then we get to the final sequence, like the Yoon fight, and there is a time skip within the book of a certain amount of time. And then Rangi and the others just sort of show up in the final battle. And it's just like, I get, on one hand, what you've accomplished in doing this is a sort of surprise return of all these characters. But I don't think the positive of that, like, cool, everyone's here surprise moment outweighs the fact that you missed having a scene between Kyoshi and Rangi making up after this proper moment where they put their relationship at a strain. Because it's quite an emotional moment where Kyoshi leaves and sort of, betrays the trust of Rangi. And you have the whole, like, Heirod and Kyoshi dynamic of, like, Kyoshi needs to do these sort of, darker things that Rangi, who, despite being this, like, bodyguard who is, like, so strong and skilled and can do what she needs to do in a lot of situations, she can't go to those dark places that some of the other characters can. And so Kyoshi does this without Rangi. And I feel like you needed to cover that just in terms of the relationship of these two characters. Rangi's one of the, like, your secondary main character to a degree. Why not do that? And then Heiron just goes missing for like nearly half the book. That feels like the only thing that I could really highlight as a proper that's my only like core negative that's actually a substantial negative about these books, is just I feel that it's maybe not 100 pages, but it feels like about 50 pages that make up maybe a chapter or two that should have been right there in between the transition from that political stuff with Zoryu into the fight with Yoon, just to set that up a little bit more. Otherwise, like, I actually think this book goes really nicely with the plots of like learning about the Fire Nation, Avatar Zito, Kyoshi and politics, introducing Zoryu, Yoon's constant attacks, trying to assassinate Heiron, the character dynamics, characters being pushed to their limits, and then building up to the big sort of political machinations from Zoryu, all the way to the kind of reveals about Karuk as Kyoshi finally decides to connect with him, and then your big ending with the major fight scene. And Yoon is cool in the first book, but he just gets to be this fascinating character in the second book, of like this literal character who's been literally thrown away, how he comes back into things and how that changes him, how being thought of as the Avatar for a couple of years and then just being abandoned because you're not, how that changes someone. That's a fascinating idea for a kind of villainous turn for an otherwise heroic character. And the fact that ultimately by the end, like, there's no getting through to him on this. Like, this is a complete life 180. This is not something that you're going to be able to talk out necessarily. And just that moment in the final conversation between them as Kyoshi realizes that she can't just talk this through, that he's getting so angry about the suggestion that he shouldn't be so angry. He's gone. That there's only one thing I can do in this situation, and that is that I have to stop him, kind of in the same way that she stopped Zhu Ping on. And it's this really tragic thing because this is like her second closest friend. Like that Yoon, Kyoshi, and Rangi is the trio of characters, trio of young characters in this book, and she is forced to kill him. And it's a different emotion to like her, I suppose, first kill, I suppose, with Zhu Ping on, because she has that personal connection. But the fact that she's able to do it is this kind of big contrast in terms of like an Aang, even like a Korra to a degree, like are characters that like probably couldn't have done that. But because we know the character that Kyoshi is, the advice that she gives to Aang about how he should handle Ozai, this is the stuff that helps to inform why spirit past life Kyoshi gave Aang that specific advice is because she's been forged into this character because of events like this, that if she can even bring herself to kill a close friend of hers who she feels is too far gone, you know, she feels like she can take out anyone that she needs to and make the decision in the right way. So that was wonderfully done. And then like the stuff at the end with like Lao Ge, the threat on Zoryu at the end, as Zoryu begins to sort of set the stage for what the Fire Lords are about to become, to set up the era that Sozin is in, the Fire Nation feeling that they can spread out. That's great, just discussion, world building throughout the books. And so it's like, I feel like I want to just discuss every chapter of these books again, but I've already done it and I feel like I've discussed it in enough detail. So just like, if you want more discussion on these books, I just would recommend going to the older videos on my channel. I have playlists up where I discuss every chapter of each of these books in detail. You know, so I have the playlist of this book, the playlist for this book, every single chapter. But yeah, I just wanted to talk about these two books again on the anniversary of the sort of end of this series, and just be like, yeah, both for being the Kyoshi story as well as just the sort of debut of the novel format for Avatar content, we had a major success across these two books. And as much as our hype is now more directed on Avatar Studios, let's not forget that when they finally do announce that next novel, there's now going to be some proper hype behind that as well, because we know it's probably going to be some of the most detailed and interesting Avatar content we are going to get. The big question at this stage is just, what story will they tell? Now, as much as I've been leaning towards, I don't think it will be another Kyoshi book. Otherwise, like, why didn't they just do this as a trilogy or something like that? So I have a feeling it probably will be something different. But what? Does it have to be about an Avatar? Does it have to be about an Avatar we know? So does it have to be about, say, a Karuk or a Yang Chen? Even a Roku? Or can we do it about one of the lesser known avatars like a Zetsu? Or even, can we tell the story of an avatar we've never met before? That would be really, really interesting. Otherwise, everyone has the usual suggestions of ideas for novels of like, this character's backstory, Red Lotus backstory. Now, what I will say about that is that I think the Red Lotus backstory probably would be very suited to be told in a novel format, because I think you probably will need the slightly more mature tone that these books have compared to Avatar especially, but even to Korra. Korra and these books are fairly on par, but just there's more of a willingness for like characters to get injured in bending fights and make it more clear about death, and you know, really get across the darker side of things. So that extra tone really works, because I've always been like, I don't think we need Avatar to go sort of full 18 plus. So I feel like these books set a nice tone for like, yeah, this is how you do a sort of darker, more gritty era for Avatar, definitely. So the final thing I'll say is just that, like, if you haven't gone back to the Kyoshi books since their release, especially like the Shadow of Kyoshi, you know, the series came to an end, reread them again. Whether you have the physical books, the digital books, or even the audio book, maybe you haven't read the audio book, check that out. Just as a different way to experience the story. Like, this is fantastic content, and that's the main thing I just want to get across in this video, is that, you know, when people suggest, you know, like, what are the go-to things for Avatar, it's like, I say, watch Avatar, watch Korra, read these two books, and then it's comics and extra stuff. And that's probably the most important thing of all. This is the most important Avatar content beyond the two shows. And you can probably make a case that for specific people, this might be the best Avatar stuff. And I don't really have too much of a problem with that. I obviously still just about probably have a preference towards, you know, the shows, just because it is a little bit more visual. But in terms of detail, world building and stuff like that, we probably get more here than we do in some of the other stuff. So there's always that kind of back and forth. But yeah, just a bit of a celebration today for the Kyoshi novels. In the comments, just again, let me know just what you think about these. Just reflecting on these two books a year on from the finishing of the duology, the initial duology. How impactful and important a piece of content do you think these two books are? And where do you think they're going to go next for novels? And when will they go back to Kyoshi's story? There's so much else still to tell. But yeah, that has been the video. Thanks for watching, and bye.